about 30 more seconds before we kick off. But as you join the Zoom, if you can just observe the normal protocols of making sure that you're muted, that'd be great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the launch of ACFID's 2026 State of the Sector report. As we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining today, which are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, as well as the elders from all of the lands that you're joining from today. I also extend that respect to all First Nations people who are with us. I'm very pleased today to welcome the Honorable Dr. Andrew Lee, the Assistant Minister for Productivity, Competition, Charities, and Treasury, who will officially launch the report and provide some opening remarks shortly. We're grateful to have the Minister with us today. Today's launch is an opportunity to reflect on how Australia's international development and humanitarian sector has evolved through a period of extraordinary change, and to consider what that means for the future of our work. I'm Matthew Morey. I'm the CEO for ACFID, and I'll be helping to moderate the event today. The 2026 State of the Sector report builds on ACFID's inaugural report, which we published in 2018. And together, these two reports provide a decade-long perspective on the health, evolution, and trajectory of Australia's not-for-profit international development and humanitarian sector. This edition of the report, in particular, spans the period from 2018 to 2024 and reflects a period marked by overlapping global crises, increasing humanitarian need, and shifting funding environments, as well as the evolving development priorities that our members face. Throughout these challenges, organizations across our sector have continued to adapt, innovate, and respond to the needs of communities around the world. The report provides an important record of that experience and valuable insights into how the sector has changed over time. For ACFID as the peak body, reports like these are important because they strengthen the evidence base that underpins effective development practice. These reports support learning, accountability, and informed decision-making, while offering insights for NGOs, governments, researchers, philanthropy, and other stakeholders who are involved with our sector. Most importantly, they help ensure that conversations about the future of the sector are grounded in evidence and focused on how we can collectively maximize impact. Among the many valuable findings in the report, I want to flag three which I thought were particularly important to note. First, that Australia's international development sector is demonstrating resilience, adaptability in a time of great global uncertainty. Despite the impacts of the pandemic, the rising humanitarian needs, and the economic pressures, the sector continues to deliver substantial international programs, maintain strong partnerships, and support communities around the world. Second, a new era of locally led development is taking shape across our sector. For the first time, this report establishes a baseline which measures how localization and the work with our civil society partners around the world is growing. It shows the strong and positive momentum that's taking place and behind the efforts to shift power and decision-making closer to communities. The third big takeaway from my perspective is that strong accountability, collaboration, and professional practice remain defining strengths for our sector. ACFID members continue to maintain universal financial transparency, high standards of ethical fundraising, and strong participation in sector-wide learning and collaboration. Today, we will be exploring further these findings and examine several related insights. I want to thank a few people who've been involved in developing this report and who will be with us today as well. I do want to acknowledge and thank our partners from Monash University, particularly Corinda Flavel, Dr. Sarah Niner, and Dr. Simanti Gunawandra for their partnership and contribution to this report. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Terrence Wood from the ANU Development Policy Center, whose work on the inaugural State of the Sector report helped lay the foundations for this second edition. Thanks as well go to ACFID's Development Practice Committee, the DPC members, who served as valuable expert reference group members. You can see from the agenda slide that should be showing up on the screen now that following the minister's remarks, Corinda Flavel and Aditri Saikia are going to, who are two of the report's authors, will be presenting an overview of the report's finding. We will then move to a panel discussion featuring Catherine Raskob, Dr. Terrence Wood, and Penny Kaleda, who facilitated by ACFID's Director of Effectiveness and Engagement, who's Emily Morton. This will be followed by a chance for you as the participants to do some Q&A. And then Gemma Porter, a member of ACFID's Development Practice Committee, is going to be sharing some thoughts on how ACFID plans to build on the report's findings and use this evidence to inform future sector initiatives. As we go, please feel free to submit questions through the Zoom chat at any time during the event. And when we get to the Q&A session, we'll be pulling those together to feed them back to the panel. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Andrew, a long-standing supporter of Australia's charitable and not-for-profit sector and a friend of ACFID, to officially launch ACFID's State of the Sector 2026 report. Thank you, Minister.
Well, thanks so much, Matthew. And I, like you did, acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose lands we're meeting today. Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawalwari, Darawari, Dindi, Wangaralin, Jinyin. I'd acknowledge all First Nations people present and the work that ACFID does to help closing the gaps. On the cover of the report, Kilu and Anita from Bobo Island and Solomon Islands, harvesting sea grapes. Sea grapes are a traditional food and an important source of livelihood. In Western Province, 4 communities have launched a women-led enterprise producing body lotion and soap from sustainably harvested sea grapes. The work draws on traditional practices and helps conserve a food source under pressure from a changing climate. It also creates new sources of income. The project's supported through Climate Resilient by Nature, an Australian government initiative delivered in partnership with WWF Australia. And that cover image to your report captures a lot of what good development looks like. Local knowledge shapes the work, a trusted partnership supplies support, environmental care and economic opportunity advance together. The photograph shows people at work, and the pages that follow give us the evidence behind that work. Good sector data helps organisations see changes and lets funders test assumptions. It gives the public a clearer view of how the sector uses trust and expertise. I'm really chuffed to launch the ACFID State of the Sector Report 2026. Thanks to ACFID and Monash University, to Corinda Flavel, Raywin Luns, Aditri Saikia, Emily Morton, Simanti Gunawandra and Sarah Niner, with support from Terrence Wood. Thank you also to the organisations that contributed data and case studies. A report this big depends on a sector willing to examine itself closely and share what it finds. As you know, this is the second State of the Sector report following the first in 2018. Across 36 indicators and 10 characteristics, it provides the most comprehensive, comparable picture of Australian development non-government organisations in nearly a decade. The pressures are plain. Inflation has increased costs. Real public donations are around 20% lower than in 2015. The share of Australian adults donating to ACFID members fell from 8.3% in 2016 to 5.7% in 2023. Across a comparable group of organisations, staffing fell by around 1/3 between 2017 and 2022. Those figures affect organisational resilience and the capacity to plan for the long term. They also shape how many communities organisations can reach. Alongside that strain, the report records strong performance across many areas. ACFID members continue to set a high standard for transparency and accountability. Audited financial reporting is universal. Compliance with ethical standards for emergency appeals is consistently high. Participation and learning remains strong, with 25 active communities of practice and more than 3/4 of members involved in at least one. The sector is also becoming more representative in important respects. Around 70% of staff are women, and women's representation among chief executives and board directors has risen since 2016. The report identifies scope for stronger data on broader forms of diversity. Better measurement will help organisations understand who holds influence and where fresh perspectives can be brought in. There's encouraging progress on climate integration. In 2023, 458 projects included an element of climate action, with most focused on building resilience. This October, that work will have a global platform in the Pacific. In partnership with Australia, Fiji and Tuvalu will host the official Pacific pre-COP events from the 5th to the 8th of October. Fiji will host the preparatory meeting, while Tuvalu will host a leaders' event. The gatherings will bring global leaders to the Pacific to see climate impacts and Pacific-led solutions firsthand. They'll also help shape priorities ahead of COP31. The report's new baseline for locally led development is another important contribution. 43% of responding members had an internal commitment or policy on locally led action or partnerships. Almost all organisations reported dedicating staff time to partner-led capacity building and institutional strengthening. Among organisations undertaking advocacy, local partners usually had some influence over that work. Locally led development means listening early and sharing decisions. It means backing local institutions and recognising where wisdom sits. That approach builds capacity close to the people affected and supports solutions grounded in local priorities. And that fits well with the Australian Government's development program. We support solutions shaped by communities themselves across climate adaptation and health, as well as education and governance. Local organisations bring knowledge and legitimacy. Australian organisations contribute expertise and long-term relationships. Australian non-government organisations are invaluable partners to governments. You mobilise quickly and work in fragile or hard-to-reach places. You reach people who can be overlooked by large systems, and you sustain relationships across political and funding cycles. Your experience also improves policy. You help government understand regional challenges and shape responses. Through deep people-to-people links, you connect Australians with our region and give local partners a stronger voice in Canberra. In 2026-27, the Albanese government will invest $5.2 billion in official development assistance, an increase of $112 million on the previous year. More than 3/4 of that investment will benefit our region, including $2.2 billion for the Pacific and $1.4 billion for Southeast Asia. At a time where aid budgets are being slashed elsewhere, Australia remains a reliable and responsive partner. Our development program helps shape a region that's more peaceful and prosperous. It strengthens relationships founded on mutual respect for sovereignty. It supports human rights and social inclusion. That includes gender equality and disability equality, along with LGBTIQ+ rights. It's also an investment in Australia's future. Helping a community withstand a cyclone or contain an infectious disease contributes to a safer region. Supporting children to learn or protecting humanitarian workers strengthens the resilience on which shared prosperity depends. Government works with a range of partners because different organisations bring different strengths. We choose delivery partners according to capability and context. Funding delivered through non-government organisations has remained broadly stable at around 10 to 11% of official development assistance over the past decade. Non-government organisations also compete for departmental procurements. The distinctive contribution of the sector deserves clear recognition within that mix. Non-government organisations bring public trust and specialist expertise. They also bring local partnerships and the patience required for work whose results unfold over years. The report's findings on public engagement deserve close attention. In 2023-24, ACFID members raised $750 million from more than 790,000 Australians. That's a huge constituency for international development, though the decline in donor participation also shows the work ahead. The strongest case for aid often begins with a truthful account of what cooperation achieves. It's harvesting sea grapes from a better managed reef. It's a health worker reaching a remote community. It's a local organisation leading through the next emergency. It's an Australian donor seeing how a modest contribution becomes a larger act of solidarity. The sector has an opportunity to tell more of these stories while keeping the rigour that this report exemplifies. Evidence gives stories weight. Stories give evidence reach. Together, that can build durable public support. The operating environment will remain demanding. Humanitarian need is rising. Climate pressure is intensifying. Civic space is narrowing in many places, and resources remain tight. This report shows the sector learning how that work has to be done in a changed world. Its strengths are substantial: professional standards and deep partnerships, alongside a culture of reflection and a broad community of Australian supporters. The report states its challenges with candour, which gives the sector a strong base for action. The task now is to use that evidence, strengthen organisations, widen the circle of Australians who see themselves as participants in development, move from local consultation towards local authority, keep testing which partnerships produce lasting benefit. The cover returns us to the heart of the work. Kilu and Anita are drawing on knowledge rooted in their community and place. Their hands are harvesting food and supporting livelihoods. Their work also cares for an ecosystem that will sustain future generations. Good development gives people greater power to shape their own future, supported by partners who respect their knowledge and back their ambition. Congratulations to ACFID, Monash University, and everyone who contributed. It's my pleasure to launch the ACFID State of the Sector Report 2026. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister, very much for those remarks, including that encouragement to continue to bring stories and evidence together in a way that's going to build even more support for our sector's work. So thank you for being with us to launch the report today. And thank you as well for your continued deep commitment and leadership on behalf of our sector, as well as more widely Australian charities. We're also appreciative of the government's ongoing partnership and support through the aid budget that you alluded to as well. I know that you're going to need to head off soon for other commitments, but we're grateful for your time today and joining us for this launch, and we look forward to continued engagement with you in your role. We're now going to dive into some of the specific findings of the report itself with two of the authors. To take us through these key findings and reflections emerging from the State of the Sector report, please join me in welcoming Corinda, who is a PhD candidate at Monash University, and Aditri, who's one of my colleagues here at ACFID, serving as our Sector Knowledge and Insights Advisor. Over to Corinda and Aditri.
Thank you, Matthew. And hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining today. As mentioned, my name is Aditri, and I'm the Sector Knowledge and Insights Advisor at ACFID. and I've had the privilege of being one of the authors on this report alongside my colleagues at Monash University, including Corinda, who'll be speaking to some of the data with me today. Just before we dive into the findings themselves, I'd like to briefly introduce the structure of the report. So this report draws on a rich range of data sources, and at its core is ACFID's annual statistical survey, which captures the activities and contributions of ACFID member organisations and provides the primary evidence base for the report. This is then complemented by data from the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission, some from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and information from other sector organisations and networks. Importantly as well is that this report is structured around 10 key characteristics, which you can see here on the slide, and each is measured through a broad range of indicators. So initially developed by Terence Wood from ANU's Development Policy Centre, who is also speaking on the panel today, and Raywin Lands, ACFID's Business Director, the framework was informed by an extensive consultation during the inaugural report and reflects what the sector identified as the essential elements of an effective, healthy, and sustainable development NGO sector. So to enable kind of meaningful comparisons over time, this second edition retains the same characteristics and for the most part, the same indicators. And it draws on data from the period 2018 to 2024. So together, these characteristics provide us with a comprehensive picture of the sector from multiple different perspectives. So they help us to understand how organisations operate internally, how they engage with and are supported by the Australian community, and how they contribute to development outcomes globally. So this is a really extensive report with a wealth of data, but what Corinda and I will be sharing today is just a snapshot of the full report. So we'll be focusing on some of the findings that we found interesting and that we think is particularly relevant for the sector at this point in time. So with that, I'll now hand over to my colleague Corinda, who will take us through the first key chapter of this report. Thanks, Corinda.
Thanks, Aditri. So my name's Corinda Flavel. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University, and I had the privilege of being part of the team that worked on this report. We open the report and an exploration of the data today by presenting some estimates of Australian registered charities undertaking or funding some kind of international development work. Using ACNC data, we took a broad approach to who was included in this group and estimate that there were just over 1,100 organisations, the vast majority of which were very small. Not many of the small charities were ACFID members, however, a majority of the large NGOs in the group are. In addition, ACFID member organisations represent a majority of the revenue generated by these 1,100 charities. ACFID members and some comparable non-members typically work on the ground overseas, either directly delivering programs themselves or partnering with local organisations, rather than a more limited funding role or principally working on domestic issues with minimal international development work. They're a substantial subset of what is commonly understood as the international development NGO sector. Thus, there's much to be learned about the sector from examining data from ACFID members as a group. So after the introduction, in Chapter 2, the report sets the scene, providing an overview of the broad environment at the time the data was taken from. Chapter 3, which we'll be discussing today, examines the international development NGO sector in Australia as a community and covers areas such as transparency and accountability, innovation, collaboration, and workforce. It also examines the key issue of adequate and sustainable resourcing, which we'll start with today. So data on total funding to the Australian International Development NGOs was kindly provided by the ANU Development Policy Centre. What is apparent by following the red line on the graph is that when looking at real or inflation-adjusted revenue, we see there was a significant rise in the years to 2014. Growth then slowed, and between 2020 and 23, real revenue declined. Just to give a reminder of the context, the last 2 of these years, there was higher than normal inflation. We then look at similar ACFID data by organisation size for the latter of these years. Large and medium-sized organisations followed the pattern just discussed, but those that were small in 2017 increased in real revenue substantially by 2023. However, there are significant differences in what organisations in the sector experienced. This graph examines data over a 7-year period and shows the number of organisations split into small in brown, medium in red, and large in blue, grouped by the level of decline or increase in real revenue. The spread of organisations across these different categories is clear from the graph and speaks to the varied experience of international development NGOs. So where does the money come from? The sector has diverse funding sources, including public donations and grants from DFAT and other Australian and overseas sources. While income sources vary for different organisations, when we examined the average proportion of total income from different streams across organisations, public donors are an extremely important funder. Including both individual and corporate donors, public donations are represented in blue in this graph, which includes recent data and that from the previous State of the Sector report. For large organisations, these donations made up an average of 44% of income, down from 51% since the last report. Public donations on average made up higher proportions of income for medium and small organisations. So Chapter 3 of the report also examines public donations and fundraising in more detail. Experiences vary across organisations, but overall the number of individual donors declined over the research period. We examined the total number of individual donors in a group of organisations where there was data every year and found that in this group there was a decline in donor numbers between 2017 and 2020, but then things began to rebound. However, donor numbers did not return to 2017 levels by 2023. Interestingly, we also found that median and average size, the median and average size of individual and corporate donations increased over this period. So we have less donors but bigger donations. How does this impact aggregate incomes from donations? Well, the ANU Development Policy Centre kindly provided aggregate data on this that indicates total donations to the sector have not kept pace with rising inflation. When we look at inflation-adjusted data, there was a decline of 20% in donations from 2015 to 2024, despite a nominal increase in donations from 2020. So this chapter of the report also examines collaborative work between and outside ACFID membership, including through a network of researchers, practitioners and policymakers, as well as engagement with the private for-profit sector. The private for-profit sector are important not only as donors, but also through corporate partnerships. This has only recently been tracked, so this is a first snapshot of what these relationships look like at the sector level. Corporate partnerships are those where there's a formal agreement between the NGO and a for-profit private sector firm. It usually involves the NGO receiving funds, goods or services in exchange for something the corporate partner sees as beneficial. We had reliable data from 80 ACFID members and found that of these, a majority of large organisations had corporate partnerships, but the opposite was true of small NGOs. No corporate partnerships are indicated in blue in the graph. The average value of each partnership was just under $114,000, so it varied significantly between large and small organisations. In total, these partnerships brought just over $60 million to these 80 organisations. And in this big chapter, we also examined staffing and unfortunately found that the total number of staff declined over the research period. But there is some good news. As you may well know, this is a sector that employs many women. The average percentage of employees that were women in ACFID member organisations was 70%. But this was not the case for leadership. The proportion of CEOs, board members, and heads of boards that were women were all lower than this. However, and really importantly, as alluded to before, there has been significant improvement since the last State of the Sector report in regards to women in leadership roles. In 2016, 32% of large organisations had women CEOs or directors, and this is now 44%. For medium-sized organisations, this increased from 29 to 53%. And there's also been improvement in heads of boards. In large organisations, 23% were women in 2016, but this has increased to 63%. So while gender quotas for boards remain low, they are significantly higher than in 2016. Now I'm going to hand back to Aditri, who will discuss chapters 4 and 5.
Thank you, Corinda. So moving on to chapter 4. So this covers characteristics 6 to 8, and it explores how ACFID members engage with the broader Australian community. So it examines the relationships that underpin the sector's work, and this includes connections with the Australian public, supporters, volunteers, and government, and how these partnerships help create the foundation for NGOs' development and humanitarian efforts. So one of the strongest findings that we're seeing in this chapter is the growth in advocacy across the sector. So today, most of ACFID members are involved in some form of advocacy activity. The most significant change has occurred among smaller organisations. So since the last report, the proportion of small organisations engaging in advocacy has increased from around 47% to 78%. Medium-sized organisations have also increased their participation by 12%, and large organisations have remained consistently active at around 91% engaged in advocacy. So taken together, these results suggest that advocacy is increasingly viewed not as a separate activity, but as an important part of how organisations pursue lasting development outcomes. So next we turn to volunteers, who continue to play a vital role across the sector. So as shown in this figure, the number of volunteers at ACFID member organisations far outweighs the number of paid staff for the year 2023, with more than 3 times as many volunteers as employees across the organisations for which data was available, which is 73 organisations. So it is worth noting that these figures are underestimated. The difference in volunteer and staff numbers is particularly evident among smaller organisations, many of which rely heavily on volunteer contributions to deliver programs, engage communities, and sustain their operations. So although the sector faces workforce challenges, these findings remind us that volunteer participation remains one of the sector's greatest strengths. Also within this chapter, we look at public attitudes towards Australian aid spending, which provides an important indicator of broader community support for international development. So this data that you see here comes from the annual Australian Aid Attitudes Survey that is conducted by the ANU Development Policy Centre, who have been tracking public perceptions of aid spending over time. So encouragingly, the latest results suggest that public sentiment is becoming more positive. In 2025, 29% of Australians believed that Australia gives too much aid, which is down from 40% the previous year. So this represents one of the strongest levels of support for aid that we've seen since 2015. A key takeaway that we're seeing from this chapter is that community support remains a cornerstone of the sector, and this is reflected in growing advocacy, high volunteer participation, and positive public attitudes towards aid. So the final chapter that sits in this report is titled In the World, and this chapter focuses on how Australian NGOs work internationally, examining where resources are directed and how organisations are responding to need across different countries and programmatic areas. When looking at geographic funding, this figure highlights the diverse geographic reach of ACFID members' work, which spans all of the major regions and includes 83 different countries. What is notable is that Africa continues to remain the largest recipient region overall, and when broken down to a country level, Papua New Guinea continues to receive the largest share of funding from ACFID members. Next, we turn to sectoral allocation, and this figure shows how project spending was allocated on average across different sectors in 2023 and broken down by organisation size. So for medium and small organisations, the largest share is concentrated across education, social and health. For large organisations on average, they focus mainly on humanitarian and social programs. So the report shows that since 2016, on average, organisations are focusing more on humanitarian spending. And this trend is especially evident among larger NGOs. So this is likely reflective of the reality of the world that we're operating in today, where humanitarian crises are becoming more frequent, more complex, and often more protracted. The key takeaway from this section is that the sector's diversity is reflected in both the wide range of programmatic work that's being undertaken and the number of countries and communities that are being reached. So this concludes the data overview section of the report, and it's important to note that today's discussion has only highlighted a small portion of the insights that are available. So I encourage everyone to take some time to explore the full report when you have the opportunity. And thanks all for your attention to this section. And I'll now hand back to Matthew to introduce the next.
Great. Thank you very much, Aditri and Corinda, for helping to unpack and dive into the report. Having heard some of the trends and the findings that have emerged from the report, the next part of our program is an opportunity through a panel discussion to explore what these findings might mean for the sector more broadly and what they tell us about the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. So to facilitate that panel, I'd like to introduce Emily Morton, who's ACFID's Effectiveness and Engagement Director, and she'll be introducing the panelists as well. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Matthew. Hi, everyone. And thank you also to Aditri and Corinda for walking us through the key findings of the report. It's always great to see sort of what gets pulled out of such a large report. There's so much to look into there. So as we've just seen, the State of the Sector report really provides quite a rich picture of the Australian development NGO sector, and it covers a wide range of topics and issues, far more than we could possibly explore in a single panel discussion. So for today's discussion and conversation, we're going to focus on one particular dimension of the report, and that's the state of the sector's relationship with the Australian community. So this includes issues such as fundraising, public engagement, how we're engaging in advocacy and public campaigning, as well as public perceptions of aid and development. And we won't be diving so much into the data that Aditri and Corinda have just presented, but we'll be exploring a bit more of the broader context that we're seeing that might be influencing some of these trends, and also thinking about what this might mean for the future of the sector. Where do we go from here? And one of the key questions, I guess, we want to explore and for you to take away at the end of today to think about yourself is about what does the data from this report tell us about what our sector needs to be thinking about and to be doing to remain relevant and resilient and connected to the Australian community in the years to come as well. So I'm really delighted to be joined by three panelists who bring really complementary perspectives to those questions and to the topic today. So Catherine Raskob is CEO of the Fundraising Institute Australasia, which is the largest representative body for the charitable fundraising sector in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So FIA's purpose is to drive fundraising excellence and a culture of professional fundraising through education and training, support and advocacy, and the promotion and protection of the fundraising sector. And I know that many ACFID members are members of FIA as well. Penny Kalita is the CEO of Habitat for Humanity Australia and a highly respected leader in the not-for-profit sector. With deep experience across both the commercial and for-purpose sectors, Penny brings real practical experience in leading an international development organisation as it tries to engage Australians in its mission. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Terence Wood. Terence is a researcher with the Development Policy Centre at the ANU, the Australian National University, And much of his research focuses on aid, including aid given by NGOs. And he also works on public attitudes to aid and public donations to NGOs. And many of you might have read his blog posts and other writings through the Development Policy Centre. So we're very pleased to have all of our panelists joining us today. And so with that in mind, we're going to start with some of the report's findings around public giving and donor engagement. Catherine, I'd like to start with you. The report suggests that many organisations are operating, or all of us are operating, in a very different fundraising environment than we were a decade ago. Public donations, as Aditri and Corinda alluded to, remain a really essential source of income across the sector, particularly for smaller organisations. But the report also shows that fewer Australians are giving, and overall donation income has not kept pace with inflation. So I wonder if you could share with us from your perspective, what are some of the factors that you think might be contributing to changes in public donations? And what have you seen in terms of how organisations are adapting their fundraising approaches in response to these changes?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. The report for ACFID and ACFID's members is sort of mirrored by the broader charitable sector in Australia and actually around the world. So a lot of the developed countries that have charitable, sizable charitable donations are also seeing similar trends, which is, fewer donors giving, but they're giving a little bit more. And so somehow donations are just barely keeping pace with inflation and sometimes falling behind. But we are seeing a decreasing number of donors giving, slightly more on average. So that is a trend we're seeing everywhere, which is worrying for all of us. I think there are a couple of factors, definitely in the last couple of years, that are contributing to that. We do some research with our research partner, More Strategic, each year. It's called the Generosity Tracker, and the recent one is May, so just a couple of months ago. And we ask similar questions like, if you're not giving as much, why is it? And no surprise this year that the number one reason is cost of living pressures. So in that report, which is amongst, I think, 3,000 known donors in Australia, 60% said that the cost of living would impact their ability to continue donating at the levels that they had previously, or to the same number of charities. And you might be aware that Australian donors in particular, they do support a number of charities, often 3 to 5, in their portfolios. So a little bit of a worrying trend there that the cost of living is really affecting them and impacting their ability to continue to consider their charitable giving. I think the other thing that's really interesting that has happened, really in the last 5 years, is that shift from that regular giving mentality that Australians had and that our parents and grandparents had, which is giving monthly, quarterly, or regularly. That was all 60% of most donations in this country, even up to 5 years ago, with sort of emergency giving hovering in the 40% range. And actually now that's flipped. And so the majority of giving in Australia now is often in response to a need or an emergency or some specific ask. And so we're seeing more than 60% of donations are coming from those emergency things, and 40% is sort of a low level of regular giving. And that's also a significant challenge for charities that rely on regular giving income to be able to plan, for the years ahead. And so really difficult and challenging times, I think, in that way. I think part of that is caused by generational changes as well. Like our parents and grandparents were very well closely tied to their communities, to organizations, to their religious, bodies, churches. Even my parents, when I grew up in the United States, they were members of, the Knights of Columbus and the Rotary Club and the Provost Club and their church and their neighborhood things. And so, giving sort of often came from those, the civil sort of society and organizations that engendered those. And we're seeing this, and Andrew Lee has discussed this many times in various presentations that he's given, which is a detachment from those organizations in younger generations and a much more sort of solitary existence. And so that connection to civil society, which used to engender charitable giving, hasn't really, sort of surfaced in the same way. And I think that's troubling, but it also gives us opportunities too. And then just finally, I think, the digital convenience and the competition for eyeballs means, that donors who are also consumers that are also looking at, everything that is available out there, are distracted by, the various opportunities for them. And so it's more, more increasingly difficult for charities to rise above it and to get their cause and the impact that, they think donors want to make in front of them. And so I think those are all the factors that are leading to that issue of declining number of donors. So a couple of things I think charities are doing, and I'm seeing this from some of our members shared between FIA and ACFID too, is, I think donor retention is such a critical piece. And sometimes boards go, oh, let's just go and acquire new donors, or let's just, go find a major gifts fundraiser and see if they can plug a $5 million hole. And I think, we really need to be careful with that kind of thinking. It is short-term thinking, and it's not actually solving the problem. And what does solve the problem is deeper relationships with the donors that we've got, and going along on a journey with them about the impact that they want to make in all stages of their lives. And so rather than relying on, let's just go try and find more new donors, I think that is really a critical part. And also maintaining an integrated channel mix. And we know that donors like to interact with charities in different ways, depending on who they are. And it's not specifically and always by generation. I think you can make some generalizations about older donors like direct mail or, whatever. But generally, I think what you need to do is understand how your donors respond best to you and use those channels, in the maximum way. And start making some investments in areas that you may not have thought of. And that's definitely the case. A lot of our members are starting to make more significant investments in gifts and fundraising, and also plan giving, which is the idea of working with donors along their life to talk about the impact they want to make in the different ways they want to contribute, and then how they want to leave a legacy after they've passed away as well. So I think those investments are really quite critical. And then also boards need to understand that in order for professional fundraisers to keep pace with the demanding demands of donors and the changing needs of donors, they need to also upskill and increase their capability. And so, when organizations start to pull back on training and education for fundraising, I think that sort of leaves fundraisers both with the lack of skill they need to sort of respond to a future of declining donors, as well as the skill in finding new ways to communicate and engage with them. So I think that's really important too. So thinking about new channels of donating, rather than relying on the major ones, thinking about, community giving. And I think that was clear in the State of the Sector report too, which is increasingly people want to be part of an impact in their local community and in their local way. And that's, giving circles and, that sort of 10 by 10 philanthropy and those kinds of opportunities, even though they come from a low base, are some areas that I think charitable organizations and professional fundraisers want to start thinking about as well. So yeah, just sort of a few ideas about responding to some of the issues regarding a decline in donor participation.
Thanks, Catherine, for that overview. There's lots to unpack there, both in terms of factors, which I'm sure will be familiar to lots of people on the call, but also then thinking ahead and how we might kind of approach things differently. I wonder, Penny, if I can turn to you then, if you can share a bit about whether does this reflect what you're seeing at Habitat for Humanity Australia, and how might you have sort of been adapting your approach to fundraising or supporter engagement more broadly in terms of some of these changes that we're seeing across the sector?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Catherine, for that big, very in-depth overview. And yes, absolutely, at Habitat, we're seeing a lot of those trends reflected in our supporter base too. And I think for us, the sort of how we're adapting our fundraising and I guess connection model with our donors is exactly what Catherine said, is building more deeper relationships, not just and we talked very much then around the generational, really from the whole family and whole community base, not just from that one donor. So I think that's really important, is understanding that the ecosystem of that one donor, that potentially that one donor, and really, making sure that there's more than just that connection point of a direct mail or an email, and really that it's been the buzzword for quite some time, but personalization, and really understanding what makes that person give to that to that cause, I guess. So that, really longer term thinking, I think, is what we've really been investing in. acquisition, as Catherine said, is, it's very costly for starters acquisition, and yes, there should be an element of investment from us and Habitat in that, but strengthening the donor base that we already have in supporter base is really important. One of the other things that we've really looking at is is the way that we talk to those donors as well. And, Matthew talked to it earlier at the beginning around evidence-led, content, and really, ensuring that our stories, instead of going out saying, support this, flooding in Nepal, actually talking about really long-term impact so that the supporter can go on that journey. It's, and again, it's very, that sort of disaster response environment is very crowded. So, and it's not a spot that Habitat plays in. We play in that, much more longer, sustainable, community, capacity building. And so actually building those campaigns around climate resilience, capacity building, inclusion, equality, and actually building those campaigns around that. And I think that's something that I'd love to see the sector move much more towards, rather than, we all saw back in, and successful or non-successful, the starvation, those sorts of, disaster response, like emotion straight away donations. What we did see from that is there is a great response initially, but then the tail sort of stops as such. So what we're trying to do at Habitat is really build that fundamental impact, that you can take, supporters along on the journey. The other point I wanted to make, which Habitat has joined the Safer for World for All campaign, which, I've been talking to some of the members there around really building that perception. We talk about 1%, and as you saw in the report, people think that we are actually giving, more than we are. And I test this at everybody I meet. If we were to give 1%, what would you think about that? And literally every conversation I have, I bring that in, and everyone's like, well, of course, why would we not? So I think that perception is something that we can really work on, is actually, which is, collectively, and again, collaboration, but collectively coming up with a great campaign that we could all go out together to really change that perception of international development funding. And we talked about that at the last level. And I guess, this is the first time that we've got 5 generations in a workforce, so it's really, first time ever we've got 5 generations in a workforce. And so that regular giving, employee giving, that's something that, I think as a sector, we haven't really nailed. And I think that's something that we can really, really do, because again, that learning and sharing, I think 63% of Generation Y won't work for an organization that doesn't demonstrate social impact. So, really tying those sorts of, corporate and opportunities together with impact opportunities, I think for us is a real opportunity. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Penny. And lots to think about from a individual organisation and leaders in those organisations, plus that collective, what can we be doing? And that Safer World for All campaign that Penny mentioned is something that I'd encourage you to have a look at online. Obviously, giving is only one important way that Australians actually engage with development organisations. It's only part of the picture. And the report also looks at some of those broader community attitudes towards aid and development. And I guess the sort of political and social context in which our organisations are trying to actually build public support for their work. So, Terence, if I can come to you, the Development Policy Centre's research on public perceptions of aid was touched on briefly by Aditri and Corinda. But I'm hoping, can you tell us a bit more about the longer term trends that we're seeing in Australians' attitudes towards aid and development? And what are the opportunities or challenges that you think that these trends present for the sector in the coming years as well?
Yeah, thank you. I've got some good news for you, some wistful news for you, some bad news for you, and an opportunity we might choose to take up. So the good news is that, as Aditri mentioned, since 2015, Australian support for aid has been increasing. It's been a very wobbly increase, but it's been an increase nonetheless, and an increase is better than a decrease. The wistful news, I guess, is that if you're to look at the patchy data from the early 2000s, you'll see that despite the increase in recent years, support for aid was much higher in say, 2005 than it is at present. What's more, there was a really clear trend in increasing support in the early 2000s. So wistfully, I'd love if we could find a way to get back to that situation. Then the bad news, of course, is that, well, it starts with a sort of a guess on my own behalf, which is I suspect that support for aid has increased since 2015 because aid has kind of fallen under the radar and it hasn't been aggressively attacked. And the bad news, therefore, is that Pauline Hanson is back, and she's back with a vengeance. And not only is she back with a vengeance, she's back and feeling vengeful. And she would like to use aid as a punching bag again. And I think that brings with it a real risk that aid's profile will rise and the intensity of attacks on aid will increase, and that may well undermine Australian support for aid. The one opportunity associated with this is that we could, if we so wanted, try and systematically test the type of messages we could use to counter those attacks. To give you one recent example, so we undertook a survey experiment in which we told Australians about the negative humanitarian or negative human impacts of the Trump aid cuts. And we found that when we told people about the impacts of the Trump aid cuts, support for aid really increased dramatically here in Australia. And what's more, it seemed to increase across the political spectrum. The increases weren't confined to the political left. So whilst the Trump aid cuts have been really, really tragic, there is possibly a lesson there, which is to do with emphasizing the human costs of aid cuts and also the human benefits when we maintain or increase aid levels. And the challenge and opportunity, I think, is for us to learn more about how we can use the right messages to counter the sorts of attacks that we might see in coming months and years as Pauline Hanson has an ever-increasing profile.
Thanks, Terence. It's a slightly sobering view, but yeah, definitely something for us to be thinking about as a sector. And again, that collaborative and collective, how we can work on that. Maybe something ACFID can be thinking about too. Catherine, I guess Penny sort of touched on it, and Terence as well, in terms of how we engage with the public in Australia, but increasingly organisations are looking sort of beyond just that sort of donor-supporter relationship and looking for other ways for people to engage, whether it's advocacy, volunteering, campaigning, etc. So what are you seeing across the broader domestic fundraising and charity sector in terms of how organisations are actually trying to build some of those deeper relationships with supporters?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing the data from this research that we've done with More Strategic on younger generations, that's exactly the way they do want to participate. And they have a very strong sort of civil society minded mentality, and they want to make change, and they want to sort of be the change, they want to see in the world, but they don't have the financial means at this point. And so I think this is where, or the charitable organizations that ignore those people do so at their peril, because those are the donors, the larger donors of the future. And I know it's difficult to invest in channels or avenues where potentially the return is not for a while. And then that's the same problem with gifts and wills fundraising. You're making an investment today for, 10, 20, 30 years down the track. And I think, strategic organizations that understand this problem will make those investments where they know that there'll be returns. It's a problem of our sector that we're short-term minded because of the way the funding works. And so, it's one of those, chicken and the egg that always occurs. But I do think that we do have data that shows younger people do want to engage in all kinds of different ways. They want to share their knowledge or their skills. They want to volunteer. They do want to be involved in advocacy and sort of making change or being part of the change. And I have seen a lot of FIA and ACFID members, including more recently, but particularly in the environmental space, really involve people in all the ways that they can participate in that charitable organization's purpose. And I think that's fantastic, and we should continue to do that because they will be the donors of the future. In fact, there's even a piece of research that we did with More Strategic that I can't remember the exact percentage, but they asked Gen X and Y, or maybe Y and Z, if they had a significant inheritance today, like a year's salary, would they be interested in donating some of it to charity? And quite a significant portion said yes. So again, they do have the desire and the interest. They at the moment may not have the financial capability. But I think what we potentially are seeing in the next couple of years is two ways. One is the relationships with donors and funders will be either very long term or increasingly transactional. And I think the models will probably coexist so that one will be highly transactional, rapid, like digital appeals or influencer-led campaigns, or really easy, frictionless giving and short bursts of support in response to visible events. And I think ACFID members are very aware of these opportunities, given emergency appeals and things like that. So I think that's the case. But the other will involve much deeper relationships, and Penny touched on this from a Habitat for Humanity perspective as well. And that's sort of really working to multi-year unrestricted funding or pooled funds, the collective impact of initiatives that I talked about earlier, donors working alongside communities and organizations over longer periods of time to affect that change. And I think our challenge will be, how to use the first model, which is the sort of transactional short burst, attention-seeking model, to introduce people to the causes that we're championing. And moving the supporters then, to the second one. So, we need to demonstrate that durable social change requires investment in people and systems and capability and organizational resilience, not just the easily marketable projects. And I think, again, successful charitable organizations over the coming years will be able to do both and put those two things together for their benefit.
Yeah, and I'll extend on that, Emily, if you don't mind, in terms of from a Habitat perspective. What we're sort of doing is doing that joint, our very deep donor and connected donor base. We're actually encouraging them to also be advocates in their local areas to their MPs as well about international aid. So, really working on that sort of strategy around, you're clearly connected and clearly feel very strongly about international development. We want you to, talk to your MP, your local MP, or your about how important you feel that this is. So again, it's that sort of collective advocacy as well as, and also from that, Habitat, as most of you would know, is built on the people movement globally. Over a million volunteers, and ultimately, we are moving closer. So the work that our volunteers do for us across the Asia and Pacific region globally, but from my perspective, Asia and Pacific region, really connecting that to the actual international development work also being done in country, the local teams, and then coming back and being an advocate for international development and housing, climate resilience, equality, and those types of things. So not only is it just to go and actually have some, an experience and impact, but also coming back and then being an advocate for that as well, and being equipped with that. So, hopefully that sort of answers that we're not only volunteers just come and volunteer, and that's great, but also that, I guess we, engage them in that advocacy piece as well.
Thanks, Penny. And Catherine, I think, in the report, Penny, like we saw that a lot more smaller and medium-sized organisations are engaging in a lot of that advocacy work, and you've sort of outlined some of the reasons why that might have some of those longer-term benefits as well of getting your supporters engaged in that advocacy piece too for your organisation in terms of building those deep connections. So that's, I think, really interesting trend that we're seeing across the sector. And we'll be able to kind of see how that goes in the future as well. So maybe if I can shift our attention a little bit now, just a bit more to the future. So the report does provide a snapshot of where the sector is today or has come from in the last kind of 6 to 8 years. But it also prompts us to think about what comes next. So in thinking about sort of what some of these trends might mean for how organisations are engaging with the public in the future, Terence, just to come to you, you've spent many years sort of studying aid, NGOs, public attitudes. Looking ahead, and you've touched on some of them in your, mentioned some of the political environment, but what developments do you think could most significantly reshape how our sector engages with the Australian community? And also partly based on your expertise too, I guess, what sort of research or data would help us to actually better understand and prepare for those changes? If you have thoughts on that.
So I have two quite different things to say here. And the first is that we in the sector really do often tend to think of aid as a numbers game. So we get very fixated on the quantity of aid that the government gives and also the quantity of aid that comes in to NGOs via donations. Now, if anyone can still remember what I said 5 minutes ago, you'll know that I am as guilty of this as everyone else is. So I'm not blaming anyone, but I'm just going to speak about a challenge because obviously every bit as important as aid quantity is aid quality and the effectiveness of the aid that we give. And if you were to think about the biggest challenge to aid quality right now, you really couldn't go beyond the new Cold War, and that is Australia and New Zealand's preoccupation in the Pacific with the presence of China and the perceived threat of China. So all of a sudden, a lot of the aid that Australia's government is giving and New Zealand's government is shaped by our perceived need to really counter China's presence in the Pacific. And we know from the old Cold War that Cold War-driven aid really isn't good for aid quality. And so I think that as a sector, we need to try and find a way of advocating against our aid being sort of captured by geostrategic interests, because if we can't find a way of successfully advocating against that, then I think we're going to find that the quality of the aid that the Australian government gives is going to be really quite negatively, is going to get worse in coming years. Now, I'm not suggesting that the quality of aid that Australian NGOs give will go down as a result, because I don't think Australian NGOs are nearly as preoccupied as the government is with China. Indeed, I think that Australian NGOs will remain ethical and effective throughout the new Cold War. But I do think that in terms of the public discussions and the advocacy that we engage in, we are going to need to find an effective way of countering the sort of attitudes that you hear a lot here in Canberra at present. And the dilemma that I think we'll find ourselves in is that while we might want to engage in advocacy on aid quality, we will still want to do that in a way that doesn't put Australians off aid altogether. So we're going to have to find the right type of messages as we engage on this important issue. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. The second point, also to do with aid quality, is completely distinct from the China issue, but is also important, I think, and it's an important opportunity to learn. And that's to do with the fact that no one likes admitting to failures. So if I mess up terribly today, I'm not going to call Stephen and tell him that I was dreadful in this presentation. Obviously, I'm going to stay quiet about it and hope that none of you dob me into my boss. No one likes to admit failures, me included. However, I think it's a real problem in the world of aid. And when I look at the sort of documents produced by the Australian Government Aid Program, but also by Australian NGOs, I find it very hard to see any examples of failures and people owning up to those failures. I do understand that because we have to answer to voters and also to donors. However, unless we engage carefully and systematically and through the form of research with the failures that we encounter or that happen as we try and give aid effectively, then we really miss the opportunity for improving the quality of our aid. And I know there is a lot of informal learning going on within NGOs and also within communities of practice, But I would like, as a researcher, I guess, and would like to think that we could all engage more systematically in learning from failures alongside successes so that we can increase the quality of the aid that NGOs give. That's all I have to say at this point.
Thanks, Terence. And I know there's a few other researchers on the call too, and certainly that partnership is something that's valued here at ACFID in terms of working with research institutions. So again, lots for us to unpack and think about in the coming years there. Catherine, I guess turning to you, I'm interested again, looking again to the future. What do you think that sustainable fundraising looks like for the sector in the future?
Well, it's interesting what Terence was saying about learning from mistakes, because I think one of the mistakes that we make as fundraisers is we're not sort of completely transparent about how we're learning from the way that funds are dispersed and the way that funds are raised. I think it would be great as a sector if we could move to you're a partner with me as a donor or funder. You're not just a transactional donor. And here's not only the impact that we've made with those, but here's what we've learned from the community or from how we've delivered it or from how we've raised it that we want to share with you so that we can actually improve and get better and so that you feel that you are a partner with us. So I really like that, Terence, and I think that's, as a sector we do need to move that way, and I think that will mean we will be more sustainable into the future. I do think we touched on a couple of the points, but definitely sustainable fundraising for sure is about those deeper connections, and also, and I know Andrew Lee likes this too, is having as much the data as possible. And I love the State of the Sector report that ACFID have done. I feel like we often lack really good data, which informs our activities. And so, this piecemeal stuff, FI does some stuff. We've got, researchers out there doing things on, what does motivate donors? What do they need? What do they want into the future? How can we adequately and effectively connect with them? So I think if we have more investments in understanding donor intentions and working on increasing our sort of authenticity and transparency in what we're doing and how we're doing it, I think that will lead to more sustainable fundraising in the future. I'd also think there'll be a shift in a professional fundraiser's role, from that sort of transaction to much more strategic. And that's, I think, how we can build a more sustainable fundraising sector as well. So, routine fundraising activities can be automated so that the value of professional fundraising would definitely be in the areas that technology can't replace, like building trust or exercising ethical judgment, understanding that human motivation, including changes over time, negotiating complex partnerships, including in the area of like planned giving and working with donors over the whole of their life and after the decisions after they die. So I think that fundraising probably needs to be sustainable, to be much more of a voice in the organizational strategy. It can't be just a revenue generating activity off the side over here that nobody knows about and that nobody takes ownership of. And I think the more and more I discuss with our members' boards of directors and CEOs, I think they're starting to understand and make that shift, that fundraising is an integral part of the organization. Even in organizations that get quite a lot of government funding, as many ACFID members do, it's still quite a critical piece, and I think it has to be part of the overall organizational strategy, especially in light of the challenge that we're facing. So I think that's the sustainable piece that we need to work towards.
Thanks, Catherine. And Penny, just some final comments from you too in terms of looking ahead, the next little while, what opportunities you see for Australian development NGOs in terms of building those deeper connections that you've mentioned with the Australian public as well.
Yeah, I think, for me, collaboration is key as well. So, really looking at where you can NGOs can complement each other rather than compete. I think that's a really, really key thing. Donors, supporters want to see more of that. And so, where Habitat can play, a part in housing solutions and those types of things. Well, how about we explore, a collaboration with action for poverty, and you know what I mean, and actually having that sort of continuum journey. I think that's really important, and that's what I'd like to see more of. And again, what I spoke about earlier in terms of just changing the public's perception. I think that's a really key and small actionable thing we could potentially do quite quickly. So that real perception about actually the reality of international development and the funding would be, for me, two areas I'd like to focus on.
Thanks, Penny. So we're going to open it up to audience questions fairly soon. But before we do, I'm going to give each of you about 30 seconds and have each of you share with us a sort of final takeaway for our audience today. So if we were looking ahead 5 years, what's one thing that Australian development NGOs should be prioritising so that they remain effective, resilient, and relevant to the context we're going to be seeing? I don't know who'd like to start first, or I can pick one of you.
To chime in.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Catherine.
I probably would say this, but definitely adherence to professional and ethical standards, including our codes. We share, ACFID and FI share the same code of conduct, which is International Statement of Ethical Principles in Fundraising. And I think the reason why that's so important is because trust and confidence on the part of donors and supporters in our organizations and in our sector, I think, will become competitive advantages, especially in a world that's sort of increasingly driven by tech and data and AI and sort of like misinformation. And so I really think that's the critical piece that we need to focus on in the coming years.
Thanks, Catherine. Penny, did you want to go next? One thing?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that sort of, that trust that, one of the things that, I love about ACFID and this space is that continual excellence for development work as well. And I think that is something that we just strengthen, our codes of practice, our locally led approach. I think that's absolutely what we should continue strengthening. And, as I said, the collaboration between the sector, which, ACFID does an amazing job in pulling us together. So for me, absolutely, they're the three things.
Thanks, Penny. And Terence?
So I would say the most important thing is effectiveness. So we want to give our aid as effectively as possible. We'd like the Australian government to give its aid as effectively as possible, and we would like to engage in public debates as effectively as possible. And to do that, in my view, I think we really need to learn by doing. We need to actively engage and learn the lessons from what we have done, and then also, of course, learning by learning. So make sure that we systematically embed learning into everything that we do.
Well, thank you to all three of you, to Catherine, Penny, and Terence, for sharing your insights with us today. I feel like there's been a lot in that discussion for us to take away and sort of think about, and certainly some of these discussion points and ideas that you've raised will be things that we'll be wanting to take forward within ACFID, in our upcoming conference as well, and in lots of the groups and spaces that we have already. So thank you for helping us kind of paint a bigger picture of what the data is telling us in the report, and also challenging us on a few things as well as a sector. So really, really appreciate your time. We're going to be, as I said, moving to some audience questions. I think there's been a few popping up in the chat, but I'm going to hand it back to Matthew, who will facilitate the Q&A session. Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Emily. And I'll echo your appreciation of the panelists. As we shift into this opportunity for all of you to ask your questions, I'll invite Emily to be part of that panel as well, as she's been very involved in the report. So depending on the questions that come in, we have a few questions that have come in the chat. And if you want to raise your virtual hand and actually come off mute as well, I can call on you and you can ask your question in real life as well. Before I do that, I will just mention that tomorrow, ACFID will be having another webinar, just launching our strategic plan, and invite any of our members who want to come along to that. And we'll be talking about our strategic plan over the next couple of months. One of the big areas of focus in our strategy is this question of public engagement, and how we continue to do more of this through advocacy, telling the stories, what it means in terms of fundraising, all those things, a real strategic focus. So there certainly are linkages and continued thinking and continued work happening. We do have a few questions that have already come in. One that's been talked around a little bit, but it's had a few people thumbs up it, so I'll ask it, and it's the question that Anthony had raised about this perhaps perceived disconnect between the fact that the people in greatest need around the world are in Africa and other parts of the world, not necessarily in the Indo-Pacific, where our government might be focusing its aid budget and aid priorities. I think encouraging in the report is the fact that we continue to see that the majority of funds raised and work being done by our ACFID's members is in Africa, where poverty is greater. But Anthony's question is, is there a risk with this divergent government kind of focus on the Indo-Pacific and geopolitical issues here versus human need that could pull the sector away from reaching those in greatest need? Any of you want to comment on that?
I mean, I'm very happy to comment. Obviously, yeah, I agree. I agree that the focus on our region is very important, and normally on your doorstep. All I can say from a habitat, from a humanity perspective, Matthew, is that we operate in 60 countries globally. We actually support Africa from really strongly from obviously other offices across the Habitat network. But obviously Habitat for Humanity Australia is very much focused in this region. But there is a significant, and I'm very happy to get those figures for anybody, but significant amount of funds, advocacy, and efforts that Habitat does to support Africa and places like that. And a recent, I guess, example of that is that we were doing infrastructure testing around paint and painting in, I can't remember the region, and again, I can get that for you, but painting the roofs of houses in Africa white with a certain paint, which reduces obviously heat insulation, which then makes that home safer. The research has shown reduction in malaria, which then of course means reduction in days off sick. That paint has now been put into the national housing standards in Africa and is being rolled out further. So although Habitat for Humanity Australia is not directly supporting Africa, there is a significant part of our network that does.
I might just jump in here because it's worth acknowledging that once upon a time, ACFID collected really good project level data from its members. So full credit to ACFID for gathering that information, and also to ACFID members for producing it. ACFID no longer does that. I think that's for understandable logistical reasons. However, in the earlier years for which data were available, there was a really clear correlation between need and where ACFID members worked. So they tended to focus the bulk of their work in countries where need was higher. And there wasn't any real obvious correlation between where ACFID members spent their donations sourced revenue and where the Australian government aid program worked. So in those earlier years, at least the focus of Australian or ACFID members seemed to be kind of independent of the Australian government's own focus area or key focus areas. In more recent years, those findings did seem to be breaking down a little bit. So perhaps in more recent years, the Australian government has started to have more influence, and perhaps that's diluted Australian NGOs' focus on the neediest countries. Although if I was to provide an overall summary for all the years which there are data, there really did seem to be a pretty good focus on need and a much lesser focus on where the Australian government was working, which is good, I think.
Maybe if
Thanks
I can jump into Matthew, just to say for those who want to explore that a bit more in the report, there is a further breakdown than what we shared today in terms of comparing where ACFID member project funding is spent, non-DFAT funds versus DFAT funds. So you can see quite clearly which are the countries that we have the greatest spend in through non-DFAT funding compared to that we get from the government, but also linking that to human development index, which is obviously one way of measuring need. But I'd encourage you to have a look in the last chapter. There's some more information there if you're interested.
Thanks, Emily. Maybe one last question, just looking at time and knowing that we're going to stop in a few minutes. And it was thrown in by Michael Stoltz. It's something we haven't really touched on much, but certainly is top of mind for all of us in different ways. And that's the question of artificial intelligence and how it intersects with the work of the sector. This panel has been talking about public engagement. So I'm interested in your thoughts on, how does it shape fundraising? How does it shape advocacy? How does it shape public perceptions and narratives and comms? So any reflections or comments people want to make?
We won't all rush in at once. I mean, I think from a fundraising perspective, probably a little bit different from sort of a humanitarian perspective, which I know there's some UN organizations that have developed some research and have some really interesting views on the humanitarian sort of approaches. But definitely from a fundraising perspective, I think it goes back to an earlier comment that I made, which is, fundraising might enable some efficiencies at the sort of the start of a relationship with the donor, or at the sort of research phase, or targeting or identifying, donors and their needs and desires and what they want to achieve. And I think we just have to be careful that it doesn't influence the sort of human interaction side of it, and the understanding and deep stewardship that we need to maintain with donors in order to keep them close to us. And again, I think if a professional fundraiser uses an approach which is, where it's appropriate on the efficiency side, but not on the interaction side, that will be an advantage in the future for them, a competitive advantage. So I think I haven't seen a lot of really significant research on, the impacts in professional fundraising per se, but I do think there's some opportunities there in terms of efficiencies.
And my only closing comment, which is something I should have said much earlier, is the type of data that emerges from these state of the sector reports and also from ACFID annual surveys of its member are actually quite rare. If you look at other OECD donor countries, it's actually quite hard to find equivalent data. So well done to ACFID for collating this information, and also well done to its members for being so willing to share it.
Thanks very much, Terence. Look, in the interest of time, unfortunately, we're going to have to shift gears to just some closing comments. But I do want to once again thank the panelists for their contributions. And look, this is just one subset of this report that we've unpacked. There's so much rich data and opportunities to go deeper in different aspects of this, which is something that ACFID will be doing. And it's a good segue over to Gemma, who's going to be sharing with us. Gemma Porter is from the International Women's Development Agency. She's also the co-chair of ACFID's Development Practice Committee, which, as I mentioned earlier, had been one of the expert reference groups helping guide the work and unpack the insights from this report. So I invite Gemma to make some comments about how this data could be used and any other closing reflections. Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks, Matthew, and hi, everyone. And thanks, Terence, for that really great segue. I agree. The Development Practice Committee works really closely at ACFID, really to kind of look at how we can kind of create and analyze data and evidence from the sector to really look at kind of sustainability, relevance, effectiveness in particular, and really looking at kind of moving us from theory into practice. So what this report obviously is just one. Over the last kind of 6 months have been 3 really critical reports for our sector. So that's this one, the state of the sector. There was the OECD DAC report from Australia, and also we commissioned a report last year around Australian NGOs as strategic delivery partners. So that's, over hundreds of pages of data and analysis, which gives us such rich information. So what the DPC has been wanting to do was really look at trying to bring those 3 critical reports together and doing some broad analysis about what the data is telling us across the board. So over the next kind of couple of months, we're going to be sharing with the sector what we're calling the signs of the times, which is kind of 5 kind of key critical themes that are coming out from the data. So one of those we've explored today, which is around public engagement. But there's 4 other kind of critical themes that are kind of coming out, which is around, one of them around localization and looking at how we're moving from rhetoric into implementation. the financial sustainability of the sector and the impacts that's having on NGOs and how we kind of need to adapt and flex. Some of the things that Penny just kind of brought up as well around how we can work more collaboratively and building that kind of strong sector narrative, not only for how we work better and more effectively, but also looking at how we enable systems change. So there's these papers that will be being released, and we're looking at how we can develop some resources and some webinars, which will lead up to the conference session in ACFID's conference. So just kind of giving you a heads up that this is something that's coming out, hopefully just will enable us to, as a sector, look at how we can meaningfully engage with this really critical information and the data, to then really think of like, what next? What can we do, and how can we influence change and work better together to kind of shape some of the narrative and the thinking at a time when the sector's in such flux. So I look forward to engaging with you, and please get in touch if you have any questions, but we'll be sharing more information soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gemma. And let me conclude our session today just by thanking the different people who've been involved. Again, thanks to Minister Lee for joining us and his contributions, to the panelists, Catherine, Terence, Penny, and Emily for facilitating that, for their contributions. I once again want to thank our colleagues from Monash University, particularly Corinda, Samantha, and Sarah, for their partnership in producing this report. And let me say, now it's over to you. We hope that this report serves as a valuable resource for you, for policymakers, researchers, and others who are interested in understanding how the sector has evolved over the past few years, and what are the opportunities and challenges that are in front of us. You can get a copy of the report on ACFID's website, and if you have any further questions or want to discuss the findings further, please don't hesitate to get in touch with ACFID. But thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.